September 18, 1993, Redwood Crest National Forest, Oregon. The Douglas firs stood like cathedral pillars against the September sky, their crowns swaying in a wind that smelled of resin and approaching rain. Grace Calder crouched beside the Coleman stove, watching coffee percolate in the battered aluminum pot her husband David had inherited from his father. The liquid bubbled dark and bitter, steam rising in lazy spirals that disappeared into the cool mountain air. "Mom, can we go get pine cones?" Emma's voice cut through the morning quiet, high and eager in the way only a 9-year-old's could be. Grace looked up to find her youngest daughter already dressed in the purple windbreaker she'd begged for at Target, blonde hair pulled into a messy ponytail that listed slightly to the left. Behind her, 12-year-old Lily stood with that particular expression of tolerant annoyance older siblings perfected, arms crossed, one hip cocked, clearly humoring her little sister's enthusiasm. "How far?" Grace asked, pouring coffee into a chipped mug that read "World's Best Mom" in fading letters. "Just behind the site," Lily said, gesturing vaguely toward the tree line that bordered their campsite's northern edge. "There's a whole bunch by that fallen log where Dad showed us the owl pellet yesterday." Grace studied the forest beyond their small clearing. Site 47 at Redwood Crest sat in a relatively isolated section of the park, surrounded by dense old-growth timber that the rangers insisted was perfectly safe for families. They'd camped here 3 years running, always requesting the same spot, always during the third weekend of September when David could get away from his accounting firm, and the girls had a teacher workday on Friday. "Your father's still sleeping," Grace said, nodding toward the tent where David's snores provided a rhythmic backdrop to the morning. "Don't go far. Stay where I can hear you if I call." "We will," Lily promised, already turning away. "Lily," Grace's voice carried the weight of maternal authority. "I mean it. 15 minutes and you stay together." The older girl rolled her eyes but nodded. Emma was already bouncing on her toes, a plastic grocery bag clutched in her small hands, ready to collect her treasures. Grace watched them disappear into the tree line. Emma's purple jacket a bright spot of color that flickered between the massive trunks before vanishing entirely. She poured a second cup of coffee and settled into one of the folding camp chairs, letting the morning settle around her. Somewhere in the distance, a jay screamed its territorial warning. Closer, a squirrel chattered from a low branch, scolding the human intrusion. The coffee was terrible, overboiled and acidic, but Grace drank it anyway, savoring these quiet moments before David woke and the day's planned hike began. She checked her watch, a practical Timex with a canvas band, noting it was just past 8:30. They'd eat breakfast, break camp partially, and hit the Sentinel Grove Trail by 10. It was the girls' favorite hike, a moderate 3-mile loop that featured several massive redwoods marked with interpretive signs about their age and ecological importance. 15 minutes passed. Grace called out, "Girls, time to come back." The forest absorbed her voice, giving nothing in return. She waited, counting to 30 in her head. Sometimes Lily got distracted, pointing out mushrooms or interesting insects to Emma, losing track of time in that way teenagers did when they thought they were being responsible. "Lily, Emma, let's go." This time Grace stood, setting her mug on the picnic table with more force than necessary. The metallic clank seemed too loud in the morning stillness. She walked to the edge of the clearing, peering into the forest where the girls had entered. The trees were dense here, their trunks so thick that 3 people couldn't wrap their arms around the circumference. Undergrowth grew in patches where light managed to penetrate. Sword ferns, salal bushes, and the thin whips of vine maple. "This isn't funny," Grace called, her voice taking on an edge. "We need to get breakfast started." Nothing. Not even the rustle of disturbed brush that would signal their return. Grace's chest tightened. Just slightly. Just enough to notice. She was being ridiculous. The girls were 50 yards away, maybe 100, crouched over pine cones and probably whispering about how uptight their mother was being. Still, she couldn't quite shake the feeling that had begun to curl around her spine like cold fingers. "David." She spoke his name firmly, but not quite loudly enough to be called a shout. Inside the tent, the snoring stopped, replaced by a confused grunt. "What's wrong?" His voice was thick with sleep. "The girls aren't answering." There was a pause, then the sound of a sleeping bag being unzipped. David emerged from the tent in boxers and a Cal Berkeley t-shirt, his dark hair standing in chaotic tufts. At 42, he still had the lean build of the college track athlete he'd been, though his face had settled into the pleasant ordinariness of middle-aged domesticity, slightly jowled, with crow's feet that deepened when he smiled. "How long have they been gone?" he asked, reaching for the jeans he'd left draped over a camp chair. 20 minutes, maybe 25. Grace heard the strain in her own voice and hated it. She was the worrier in the family, the one who checked door locks twice and made the girls call when they arrived at friends' houses. David was the rational one, the steady presence who talked her down from anxiety spirals. "They probably found something interesting," David said, pulling on his hiking boots without bothering to tie them. "You know how Lily gets when she's playing junior naturalist." But he was already moving toward the tree line, and Grace noticed he was walking faster than his casual tone suggested. She followed, her own sneakers, old Nikes with fraying laces, crunching on the carpet of dried needles and small twigs. They entered the forest together, calling the girls' names in alternating rhythm. The temperature dropped immediately, the canopy blocking most of the morning sun. Grace's eyes adjusted slowly to the gloom, picking out details. A banana slug crossing a patch of moss, bright orange against the green. A cluster of chicken-of-the-woods mushrooms growing shelf-like from a rotting stump. A deer trail cutting through the salal. "There's the log," David said, pointing to a massive fallen Douglas fir about 40 yards ahead. Its trunk had to be 6 feet in diameter, the wood silver-gray with age, draped in moss and small ferns that grew from accumulated soil in the bark's crevices. They reached it quickly, Grace's heart now beating hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. The area around the log was carpeted with pine cones, hundreds of them, in various stages of decay, from fresh and tightly closed to old and weathered open. It was exactly the kind of place Emma would have squealed over, immediately dropping to her knees to begin collection. But there were no girls. No purple windbreaker visible through the trees. No sound of Emma's chatter or Lily's patient corrections. "Lily! Emma!" David's voice boomed now, loud enough to send a raven exploding from a nearby branch with an indignant croak. Grace spun in a slow circle, searching for any sign of their daughters. The forest looked the same in every direction, massive trees, undergrowth, shadows. She had no idea which way the campsite was anymore. They'd walked in a relatively straight line, but the trees played tricks with perspective and distance. "Maybe they went further," she said, hating how thin her voice sounded, looking for a different spot. David was already moving, pushing through a patch of salal that clutched at his jeans with small branches. Grace followed, brambles catching her fleece pullover. They walked for 5 minutes, then 10, calling the girls' names until Grace's throat felt raw. The forest seemed to swallow the sound, giving back only silence and the occasional bird call. When they stopped, both breathing hard, Grace looked at her husband and saw her own fear reflected in his face. The rational mask had cracked, revealing something primitive underneath, a parent's terror at the absence of their children. "We need to get help," David said quietly. They made their way back to the campsite. Grace was surprised to find it easily, the bright orange tent visible through the trees like a beacon. David went straight for their truck, a forest green Ford Ranger parked at the site's designated spot. Grace watched him dig through the glove compartment, searching for the park map that showed ranger station locations. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs, trying to will steadiness into her limbs. This was a mistake, a miscommunication. The girls had simply walked further than they'd intended, gotten turned around in the trees. Any moment now they'd emerge from the forest, Emma probably crying, Lily trying to be brave, both of them apologizing for scaring their parents. "Closest station is about 3 miles back toward the main road," David said, studying the map. "Or I can drive to the entrance and get someone there." "I'll stay here," Grace said immediately, "in case they come back." David looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Keep calling for them. Walk around the campsite perimeter. But Grace," he paused, struggling with words. "Don't go too far. I need to know where you are, too." He was in the truck and gone within minutes, kicking up a small cloud of dust as he accelerated down the unpaved camp road. Grace stood in the sudden silence, watching the dust settle. Then she turned back to the forest and started calling her daughter's names. September 18th, 1993, 11:47 a.m. Ranger Thomas Whitmore arrived in a Park Service truck, followed by David in the Ford. A second ranger, a younger woman with her hair in a tight bun, pulled up moments later in an ATV. Grace had been calling for the girls for over 3 hours, her voice now reduced to a hoarse croak. She'd walked the perimeter of Site 47 so many times she'd worn a faint path in the needle-covered ground. Whitmore was in his mid-50s, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades outdoors. He had kind eyes and a graying mustache, and when he spoke to Grace, his voice carried a professional calm that somehow made everything worse. "Mrs. Calder, I need you to show me exactly where the girls entered the forest." Grace led him to the spot, acutely aware of David hovering at her elbow, silent and tense. The female ranger, her name tag read K. Martinez, took notes in a small spiral-bound notebook. "And you last saw them at approximately 8:30? Whitmore asked. 8:33, Grace said. She checked her watch, burned the time into her memory. "I gave them 15 minutes. When they didn't come back, I started calling around 8:50. "Did they have any supplies? Water? Snacks? Jackets?" Emma had her windbreaker, purple, bright purple. Lily was wearing jeans and a gray hoodie, no water. They were just... Grace's voice cracked. "They were just getting pine cones." Whitmore exchanged a glance with Martinez. Something passed between them, some silent communication that made Grace's stomach drop. "What?" she demanded. "What is it?" "Nothing, Mrs. Calder," Whitmore said gently. "We're just going to start organizing a search. Martinez, radio for additional personnel. I want 3 teams ready to deploy within the hour." The ranger spoke into her radio, using codes Grace didn't understand. Within minutes, more vehicles began arriving. Rangers, volunteer search and rescue teams, a local sheriff's deputy in a tan uniform. The quiet campsite transformed into a command center, people spreading maps across picnic tables, discussing grid patterns and search zones. Grace stood at the edge of the activity, watching strangers organize the search for her missing daughters. David had been pulled aside by one of the deputies, answering questions in a low voice. She caught fragments. Normal morning. No arguments. Happy? They were happy. A woman in her 30s approached Grace, wearing civilian clothes but carrying a radio. "Mrs. Calder? I'm Jennifer Hayes, with Central Oregon Search and Rescue. I need to get detailed descriptions of your daughters." Grace recited the information mechanically. Emma, 9 years old, 4'3", 65 pounds, blonde hair to her shoulders, blue eyes, gap between her front teeth. Lily, 12, 5'1", 90 pounds, darker blonde hair worn in a braid, hazel eyes, small scar on her left knee from a bicycle accident 2 summers ago. "What were they wearing?" Hayes asked. Grace described the clothes, then remembered. "Emma's wearing her friendship bracelet. I made it for her last month, purple and pink thread with little silver beads. Lily has a matching one, but hers is blue and green." Hayes wrote everything down. "This is helpful. Do you have recent photos?" David appeared at Grace's side, pulling out his wallet. He extracted 2 school photos, Emma's from 3rd grade, Lily's from 7th. Both girls smiled at the camera with the awkward self-consciousness of children told to say, "cheese." "We'll make copies," Hayes said. "Get them distributed." By noon, the search was fully underway. Grace stood at the edge of the forest watching teams disappear into the trees in organized formations, their voices calling her daughters' names in a chorus that echoed through the woods. Someone had brought a folding chair and placed it near the picnic table, clearly intending for her to sit to wait. She ignored it. David tried to get her to drink water. She pushed the bottle away. "Grace, you need to—" "Don't," she said flatly. "Don't tell me what I need." He fell silent, but stayed close, a presence at her shoulder that was both comforting and suffocating. As afternoon stretched toward evening, the search team cycled in and out, reporting negative findings over and over. No sign of the girls, no physical evidence, no dropped items, no footprints in the soft earth, no disturbance in the undergrowth that would suggest two children had passed through. It was as if Emma and Lily had simply vanished, dissolving into the forest like morning mist. At some point, a news van arrived, parking just beyond the official perimeter. Grace watched a reporter in a red blazer step out, followed by a cameraman. The deputy, she'd learned his name was Marcus Webb, immediately moved to intercept them. How did they even know? Grace asked no one in particular. Ranger Whitmore, standing nearby with a thermos of coffee, answered, "Scanner traffic. They listen to emergency frequencies." The reporter was gesturing animatedly at Webb, clearly arguing for access. The deputy was shaking his head, his body language firm. Eventually, the reporter retreated to the van, but Grace could see her speaking into a microphone, the camera pointed at the forest behind her. "Mrs. Calder." Whitmore approached carefully, the way someone might approach a skittish animal. "We're going to keep searching through the night. I've called in additional teams from neighboring counties. We have dogs coming from Portland. Should be here within 2 hours. Helicopter with thermal imaging will start flying patterns at first light." Grace heard the words, but they seemed to come from very far away. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "I need to ask you something," Whitmore continued, his tone apologetic. "Is there any reason your daughters might have run away? Any problems at home, at school?" The question landed like a physical blow. Grace's head snapped up, fury burning through the numbness. "My daughters did not run away. They were collecting pine cones. They're 9 and 12 years old." "I have to ask," Whitmore said gently. "It's part of the protocol." "They're happy kids," David interjected, his voice strained. "Good students, lots of friends, no problems. He paused, struggling. "We're a happy family." Whitmore nodded, making a note in his own small notebook. "I believe you. But we have to consider every possibility." As darkness fell over Redwood Crest, the forest transformed into something alien and hostile. Flashlight beams cut through the trees like lightsabers, searchers' voices taking on an eerie quality in the dark. Someone had set up generator-powered floodlights around Site 47, turning the campsite into an island of harsh white light surrounded by impenetrable shadow. Grace couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten. David had pressed a granola bar into her hand at some point. She'd taken one bite and found she couldn't swallow, her throat too tight. The wrapper sat on the picnic table, the bar fossilizing in the cool night air. Around 10 p.m., the search dogs arrived, 3 German shepherds with handlers in orange vests. Grace watched as they were given items from the girls' luggage to smell. Emma's stuffed rabbit, Lily's hairbrush. The dogs strained at their leashes, eager to work, and Grace felt a surge of hope so intense it was painful. But an hour later, the dogs returned with their handlers, looking confused and frustrated. One of the handlers, a bearded man in his 40s, spoke quietly with Whitmore while Grace strained to hear. No trail, nothing beyond 50 yards from the campsite. Like they just stopped existing. Grace's knees buckled. David caught her, his arms wrapping around her waist, holding her upright. She could feel him shaking, or maybe that was her own trembling. She couldn't tell anymore. "We should go home," David said quietly, his mouth close to her ear. "Let them search. We're not helping by—" "No." Grace pulled away from him, standing on her own. "I'm not leaving. Not without them. Grace." I said no. They spent the night in the truck, the tent abandoned and forgotten. Grace sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the searchers' flashlights moving through the trees like earthbound stars. David dozed fitfully behind the wheel, jerking awake every 20 minutes or so, disoriented and afraid. Sometime around 3 a.m., Grace spoke into the darkness. "Someone took them." David didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was careful. "You don't know that." They didn't get lost. 2 smart girls staying together in daylight, less than 100 yards from camp. They didn't get lost, David. Then what happened? The question was almost angry, driven by his own fear and helplessness. What are you saying happened? Grace didn't answer. She didn't have an answer, only a certainty that sat like a stone in her chest, cold and unmoving. Somewhere in these woods, something terrible had occurred. And no one, not the rangers, not the deputies, not the dogs, had any idea what that something was. The night crawled toward dawn with excruciating slowness. Grace watched the sky lighten by imperceptible degrees, the darkness fading to gray, then to the pale blue of early morning. The searchers changed shifts, fresh teams replacing exhausted ones. The helicopter arrived at 6 a.m., its rotors beating the air with a sound like thunder, passing back and forth over the forest in methodical patterns. By noon on the second day, the search had expanded to cover 5 square miles. Over 100 people combed through the undergrowth, calling for Emma and Lily until their voices gave out. The news crews multiplied. 3 vans now, then 4, creating a small media encampment just outside the park boundary. Deputy Webb approached Grace and David in the late afternoon, his expression grave. "Folks, I need to be straight with you. We've searched every inch of the immediate area. We found nothing, not a single trace. That's unusual. Really unusual." "What does that mean?" Grace demanded. Webb hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It means we need to consider the possibility that your daughters left the area, whether on their own or otherwise." The unspoken words hung in the air between them. Abduction. Someone had taken Emma and Lily. "Who?" David asked, his voice breaking. "Who would do this? We're in a national park. There was no one else around. We didn't see anyone at any of the nearby sites. Who could have—" He couldn't finish. Grace reached for his hand, gripping it hard enough that her knuckles went white. "We're bringing in additional resources," Webb said. "FBI has been contacted. They're sending agents who specialize in missing children cases. And we're going to start looking at everyone who was in the park that weekend. Campers, day hikers, employees, everyone." Grace found her voice, surprised at how steady it sounded. "We're not leaving, not until we find them." Webb nodded. "I understand. We've arranged for you to stay at a motel in Eugene. Close enough that you can be here every day, but you need somewhere to rest, to process everything." "I don't want to process," he and Grace said. "I want my daughters back." "I know," Webb said softly. "Everyone here does. We're not giving up, Mrs. Calder. We're just getting started." But as the sun set on the second day, painting the forest in shades of crimson and gold, Grace stood at the edge of the tree line and felt something inside her break. Not cleanly, not in a way that could be repaired. It was a fracture deep and spreading, and she knew with terrible certainty that even if they found Emma and Lily tomorrow, she would never be whole again. The forest had swallowed her daughters, and all Grace could do was stand at its edge, calling their names into the gathering darkness, hoping against hope that somewhere in those endless trees, someone was listening. September 20th, 1993. Day 3. The FBI agents arrived in 2 unmarked sedans, charcoal gray and anonymous, pulling into the Redwood Crest parking area just after dawn. Grace watched them from her position near the command tent, a canvas structure that had been erected overnight, complete with folding tables covered in maps, radios, and styrofoam coffee cups. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Emma's purple windbreaker disappearing into the trees, over and over like a film strip stuck on loop. The lead agent was a woman in her early 40s, trim and professional in dark slacks and a navy blazer despite the cool morning temperature. She approached with measured confidence, her credentials already in hand. "Mr. and Mrs. Calder, I'm Special Agent Victoria Chen, FBI Crimes Against Children Division. This is my partner, Agent Marcus Reeves." She gestured to the man beside her, tall, African-American, with wire-rimmed glasses and a gentle expression that seemed at odds with his imposing physical presence. Grace shook their hands mechanically. David did the same, his grip lingering a moment too long, as if the agents represented some tangible lifeline. "We've been briefed on the situation," Chen continued, her dark eyes moving between them with clinical assessment. I want you to know that we're going to do everything possible to find Emma and Lily. But I need your complete cooperation. That means answering questions that may be difficult or seem invasive. Can you do that? Yes, Grace said immediately. Anything. They were led to a quiet corner of the command tent, away from the rangers and volunteers who were planning the day's expanded search grid. Chen produced a small recording device, placing it on the table between them. I'm going to record this conversation, she explained. Standard procedure. Now, I need you to walk me through the morning of September 18th in as much detail as you can remember. Start from when you woke up. Grace recounted the story again. The coffee, Emma's request, her warning to stay close, the 15 minutes that stretched into forever. She described the campsite, the tree line, the fallen log where they'd expected to find the girls gathering pine cones. Chen listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes in a small leather-bound journal. When Grace finished, Chen leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Calder, in the days before you came camping, did you notice anyone following you? Anyone taking unusual interest in your family? The question sent ice through Grace's veins. No, nothing like that. What about at the campground itself? Did you see anyone watching the girls? Anyone who seemed out of place? Grace tried to think back. They'd arrived Friday evening, set up camp in the fading light. The neighboring sites had been empty, Site 46 to their south, Site 48 to their north. She remembered being pleased about the isolation, the sense of having the forest to themselves. There was no one, she said slowly. The closest occupied site was probably a quarter-mile away. We passed a family on the road coming in, an RV with California plates, but we didn't interact with them. Agent Reeves spoke for the first time, his voice surprisingly soft. What about park employees, rangers, maintenance workers? Anyone who might have had reason to be in your area? David stirred. That ranger, Whitmore, he drove past our site Friday night, waved at us. He was doing his rounds, I guess. Chen made a note. Anyone else? There was a maintenance truck, Grace said, the memory surfacing suddenly. Saturday morning early. I was making coffee and I heard it drive past. I didn't see who was in it. What time? Maybe 7:30. The girls were still asleep. Chen and Reeves exchanged a glance. Something wordless passed between them. The kind of communication Grace had seen between Whitmore and Martinez, the language of law enforcement professionals who'd worked together long enough to read each other's thoughts. What? Grace demanded. What does that mean? It means we'll check the maintenance logs, Chen said evenly. See who was authorized to be in that area and why. Mrs. Calder, I need to ask you something and I need you to be completely honest with me. Is there any possibility, any at all, that your daughters staged this disappearance? That they might be hiding to get attention or… No. Grace's voice was flat, absolute. Emma is 9 years old, Lily is 12. They were collecting pine cones, not running away. Sometimes children don't understand the consequences. I know my daughters. Grace felt David's hand on her arm, a warning to stay calm, but she shook him off. They didn't run away. Someone took them. Chen's expression didn't change. What makes you so certain? Because the dogs found nothing. Because there's no trail. Because 2 children don't just vanish into thin air in broad daylight. Grace's voice was rising despite her efforts to control it. Why are you wasting time asking me if my daughters ran away when you should be looking for whoever took them? We are looking, Reeves interjected gently. We have over 100 people searching, but we also have to eliminate other possibilities. That's not an insult to you or your family. It's how we find answers. Grace subsided, suddenly exhausted. David's hand remained on her arm, and this time she didn't pull away. Chen continued, her tone measured and professional. I need you to think carefully. Is there anyone who might want to hurt you or your husband? Anyone who might target your daughters to get at you? An angry employee? A disgruntled client? An ex-partner? David shook his head slowly. I'm an accountant. Grace is a substitute teacher. We don't have enemies. We're boring, Normal people with boring, normal lives. What about extended family? Any custody disputes, inheritance issues, family conflicts? My parents are dead, Grace said. David's parents live in Florida. We see them twice a year. David has a brother in Seattle. They haven't spoken in 5 years over something stupid. That's it. That's our whole family drama. The interview continued for another hour, covering everything from the girls' friendships to their school performance to whether they'd ever mentioned feeling uncomfortable around any adults. Grace answered mechanically, aware that they were being evaluated, assessed for signs of deception or guilt. She'd seen enough crime shows to know that parents were always the first suspects. When they were finally released, the morning sun was burning off the early fog, revealing the forest in harsh detail. Grace walked to the tree line again, drawn by some compulsion she couldn't name. A new shift of searchers was assembling, receiving instructions from a coordinator with a clipboard. We're expanding west today, the coordinator was saying. Teams of 4, staggered grid pattern. Remember, you're looking for anything unusual. Disturbed earth, broken branches, torn fabric. If you find something, you mark the location and radio immediately. Do not contaminate the scene. Grace closed her eyes, trying to imagine where her daughters might be. Were they hurt? Scared? Were they still alive? The questions circled endlessly, unanswerable and torturous. Mrs. Calder? She turned to find a woman in her 60s standing a few feet away. She had steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and wore hiking boots that had seen serious use. Her face was weathered but kind, mapped with lines that suggested a life spent outdoors. I'm sorry to bother you, the woman continued. My name is Patricia Drummond. I'm with the Cascade Mountain Search and Rescue. I've been doing this for 30 years. Grace waited, unsure what was expected of her. Patricia stepped closer, lowering her voice. I wanted to tell you something. In all my years doing search and rescue, I've learned that children are resilient. They're tougher than we give them credit for. If your girls are out there, if they're together, they're looking out for each other, and we're going to find them. The kindness was almost unbearable. Grace felt her throat close, tears threatening. She managed a nod, not trusting her voice. Patricia squeezed her shoulder briefly, then moved away to join her team. Grace watched her disappear into the forest, one more searcher among dozens, all looking for 2 little girls who'd vanished like smoke. September 21st, 1993, Day 4. The media presence had grown exponentially. What had started with a single news van had metastasized into a full encampment. Satellite trucks, reporters doing stand-ups with the forest as backdrop, photographers with long lenses trying to capture images of the grieving parents. Deputy Webb had established a perimeter, but the press hovered just beyond it, vultures circling tragedy. Grace had done one interview, at Chen's suggestion. A local news anchor named Diane Morrison, sympathetic and professional, had asked gentle questions while Grace clutched school photos of Emma and Lily, appealing to anyone who might have seen something, anything. David had sat beside her, silent and hollow-eyed, nodding occasionally but unable to speak. The interview had aired on the evening news. By the next morning, the story had been picked up regionally, then nationally. Grace's face, aged a decade in 4 days, eyes haunted and desperate, appeared on CNN. The case had a terrible magnetic pull. 2 innocent girls, a national forest, no trace, no answers. With the media attention came tips, hundreds of them, flooding the FBI's dedicated hotline. Chen had briefed Grace and David on the reality of such calls. Most would be well-meaning but useless. Sightings of girls who resembled Emma and Lily but weren't them. Some would be from psychics claiming visions. A few would be cruel hoaxes. We follow up on everything, Chen assured them. Every single call gets evaluated. We're not dismissing anything. But as the tips poured in, a girl matching Emma's description seen at a rest stop in Idaho, someone claiming to have heard children crying in the woods near Mount Hood, a psychic insisting the girls were being held in an underground bunker. Grace could see the strain on Chen's face. They were drowning in information, and none of it was bringing them closer to answers. On the 4th day, the search expanded to include nearby lakes and rivers. Dive teams arrived with sonar equipment, their presence suggesting a possibility that no one wanted to voice aloud. Grace watched the divers enter the water at Cooper's Lake, 3 miles from the campsite, and felt something inside her turn to stone. David had retreated into himself, speaking in monosyllables, his movements automatic and mechanical. He'd taken to walking the perimeter of the search area, following teams into the forest, and then standing at the edge of the grid watching them work. Grace knew he was torturing himself, imagining every possible scenario, each worse than the last. Agent Reeves found Grace near the command tent in the late afternoon, his expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Calder, we need to search your home." Grace stared at him. "What?" "It's standard procedure in cases like this. We need to examine the girls' rooms, their computers if they have them, any diaries or journals. We need to build a complete picture of their lives. You think we did something to our daughters?" It wasn't a question. Reeves's face softened slightly. "No, but we need to rule things out. And sometimes children leave clues in their personal spaces, things they might not tell their parents directly. A note about someone who made them uncomfortable. An online conversation with someone they shouldn't have been talking to. They don't have computers," Grace said numbly. "Emma has a diary, pink with a lock. Lily keeps a journal for English class. We'll need to see those. And I need your permission to access your home." Grace signed the consent form without reading it. What did it matter? Let them search. Let them pry into every corner of their lives. If it helped find Emma and Lily, she'd let them tear the house down to its foundation. September 23, 1993, Day 6. The vigil was held at the entrance to Redwood Crest, organized by the local community with frightening efficiency. Hundreds of people gathered at dusk, holding candles that flickered in the evening breeze. Grace and David stood at the center, surrounded by strangers offering prayers and platitudes. Someone had created a banner, "Bring Emma and Lily home," decorated with hand-drawn flowers and messages of hope. Grace looked at the faces around her, blurred by candlelight and her own exhaustion. She recognized Ranger Whitmore, his weathered features drawn with concern. Deputy Webb stood at the periphery, watching the crowd with professional vigilance. Patricia Drummond from Search and Rescue was there, along with dozens of volunteers who'd spent the past week combing through the forest. A local pastor, Grace didn't catch his name, said words about faith and community and not losing hope. She heard none of it, the syllables washing over her like white noise. Lily would have been embarrassed by this display, self-conscious about being the center of attention. Emma would have loved it, soaking up the candles and singing and communal emotion. When it was over, when the crowd had dispersed and the candles had been extinguished, Grace and David returned to their motel room in Eugene. It was a depressing place, worn carpet, thin walls, the smell of industrial cleaner failing to mask decades of cigarette smoke. They'd been there for 5 nights, sleeping in separate beds, barely speaking. Grace lay awake, staring at the water-stained ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of the highway beyond their window. Somewhere out there, Emma and Lily were sleeping, or not sleeping. Were they cold, hungry, crying for their mother? Or were they past crying, past hope, past everything? The thought was unbearable. Grace forced it away, replacing it with memories. Emma at 5, learning to ride a bike, her face fierce with concentration. Lily at 8, winning the school spelling bee, her shy smile when they'd called her name. Summer days at the community pool. Winter evenings reading together on the couch. 1,000 small moments that added up to a life, to a family. "Grace?" David's voice came from the darkness, tentative. "Yeah? What if they don't find them?" She had no answer. The question hung between them, terrible and necessary. September 27, 1993, Day 10. Agent Chen requested a meeting at the FBI field office in Eugene. Grace and David drove there in silence, the landscape passing in a blur of autumn colors they didn't see. The office was utilitarian, gray carpet, fluorescent lights, the sterile efficiency of government bureaucracy. Chen's face told Grace everything before she spoke. There was no good news coming. We've completed the ground search, Chen said, her voice gentle but firm. Over 200 people have covered more than 15 square miles. We've used dogs, helicopters, thermal imaging, sonar. We've interviewed every person who was in the park that weekend, checked their backgrounds, verified their alibis. We followed up on more than 800 tips from the hotline. And? Grace's voice was barely a whisper. And we found nothing. No physical evidence, no witnesses, no leads that have panned out. Chen paused, choosing her words carefully. The active ground search is being scaled back. We'll maintain a presence at the park, and we're keeping the tip line open. But the reality is that we've exhausted the immediate search options. You're giving up, David said flatly. No, Chen said firmly. We're not giving up. This case remains open and active, but we need to shift our approach. We're focusing now on investigating possible abduction scenarios, checking sex offender registries, looking at individuals with histories of crimes against children, examining anyone who might have had opportunity and access. Grace felt the room tilt slightly. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. You think they're dead. I don't know what happened to your daughters, Mrs. Calder. I wish I did. But I'm not assuming anything. Children have been recovered after weeks, months, even years. We don't stop looking. But Grace could read the truth in Chen's eyes, in the set of her shoulders, in the careful professionalism that allowed her to deliver devastating news without breaking. The FBI believed Emma and Lily were dead. Maybe not officially, maybe not in reports and press conferences, but in the quiet calculations that experienced agents made, they were dead. I want to go back to the campsite, Grace said suddenly. Chen frowned. Mrs. Calder, I don't think... I need to see it again. Where it happened. I need to stand there. David was looking at her with concern, but she ignored him. She needed this, needed to be in that place again, to try and understand what had happened in those missing moments. I'll take you, Chen said quietly. Tomorrow morning. September 28, 1993. Site 47 looked abandoned and forlorn in the gray morning light. The orange tent was gone, packed away weeks ago. Yellow police tape still marked the tree line where Emma and Lily had entered the forest. Grace ducked under it, ignoring Chen's cautionary hand on her arm. The forest was different now. The search teams had left traces, flagging tape on branches marking grid coordinates, disturbed undergrowth where dozens of feet had trampled through. Grace walked to the fallen log, the one where pine cones still lay scattered like small wooden roses. She knelt, running her hands over the rough bark. This was the last place they'd expected to find the girls. This was where the trail ended, where logic and evidence ceased to exist. Mrs. Calder? Chen stood a respectful distance away. Are you okay? Grace looked up at the massive trees surrounding them, their crowns disappearing into morning fog. Somewhere in this forest her daughters had met someone or something. Somewhere in these thousands of acres, there were answers. She just had to find them. I'm going to keep looking, Grace said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. I don't care how long it takes. I don't care if everyone else gives up. I'm going to find out what happened to Emma and Lily. Chen nodded slowly. I understand. But Grace knew she couldn't possibly understand. No one could, unless they'd stood in this exact spot, feeling the absence of their children like a physical wound, knowing that somewhere in the silence of ancient trees the truth was waiting. Grace stayed at Site 47 until the afternoon shadows grew long, memorizing every detail, burning the place into her memory. When she finally returned to the parking area, she found David waiting in the truck, his face gray and defeated. We should go home, he said when she climbed in. There's nothing more we can do here. But he was wrong. There was everything to do. The search might be scaling back, the FBI might be shifting focus, but Grace's search was just beginning. She would return to this forest again and again. She would talk to every person who'd been here that weekend. She would chase down every lead, every whisper, every impossible hope. Because somewhere in Redwood Crest National Forest, her daughters had vanished, and Grace Calder wasn't leaving until she understood why. Dachshwauer 1994. 1 year later. Grace stood in the doorway of Emma's bedroom, her hand resting on the doorframe as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. The room remained exactly as it had been on September 17, 1993, the day before everything ended. Emma's bed was still unmade, the purple comforter tangled at the foot where she'd kicked it off that last morning. Her stuffed rabbit sat propped against the pillows, button eyes catching the afternoon light filtering through the gauzy curtains. On the desk, Emma's collection of rocks and pine cones sat in careful arrangement, each specimen labeled in the careful print of a 9-year-old who took her treasures seriously. Grace had dusted them once a month, maintaining the collection with archaeological reverence, as if Emma might return at any moment and notice if anything had been disturbed. Down the hall, Lily's room told a similar story of suspended time. Her walls were covered with posters, a Nirvana album cover, a photograph of Jane Goodall with chimpanzees, an inspirational quote about courage that her 7th-grade English teacher had given her. The bed was made, hospital corners precise, because Lily had been the organized one, the responsible older sister. Her journal still sat on the nightstand, the last entry dated September 16, 1993. Going camping tomorrow. Emma is being annoying about what snacks to bring. Sometimes I wish I was an only child. But not really. Grace had read that entry 1,000 times, torturing herself with the casual cruelty of it. Sometimes I wish I was an only child. Those words had acquired unbearable weight, as if Lily's throwaway frustration had somehow manifested into dark reality. Grace? David's voice drifted up from downstairs. Are you coming down? She didn't answer. The house in suburban Portland had become a mausoleum, every room a shrine to before. David wanted to move. He'd been suggesting it for months, gently at first, then with increasing desperation. We need a fresh start, he'd said last week. This house is killing us. But Grace couldn't leave. To leave would be to abandon Emma and Lily, to sever the last physical connection to their daughters. What if they came home and found the house sold, their rooms dismantled, their parents gone? The thought was unthinkable. The doorbell rang. Grace heard David's footsteps, the creak of the front door opening, muffled voices. She forced herself to move, descending the stairs with leaden feet. Agent Chen stood in the foyer, her dark hair shorter than it had been last fall, her face professionally sympathetic. Grace knew immediately that this wasn't a social call. Chen only appeared in person when there was something to discuss, usually something that required careful delivery. Mrs. Calder, Chen said. I hope I'm not intruding. I tried to call, but the phone's unplugged, Grace said flatly. She'd stopped answering calls months ago, unable to handle another reporter, another psychic, another well-meaning stranger with useless condolences. May I come in? They sat in the living room, Grace and David on the couch, Chen in the armchair that no one used anymore. It had been Lily's favorite spot for reading, and seeing someone else occupy it made Grace's chest tighten. I wanted to update you in person, Chen began. We've had some developments. Grace leaned forward, hope and dread warring in her chest. You found something? Not exactly. But we've been building a profile of potential suspects, cross-referencing anyone who was in the Redwood Crest area that weekend with individuals who have histories of crimes against children. One name has surfaced repeatedly. Kenneth Hartley. The name meant nothing to Grace. She exchanged a glance with David, who looked equally blank. Chen continued. Hartley is 53, a long-haul trucker based out of Sacramento. He has a record: indecent exposure in 1987, unlawful contact with a minor in 1990. Nothing violent, but the pattern is concerning. We've been tracking his movements, and his truck logs show he passed through Oregon on September 17, 1993. He claims he stayed on I-5, never stopped at any state or national parks. But we're skeptical. Do you think he took them? David's voice cracked on the last word. I think he's worth investigating thoroughly. We're working with California authorities to bring him in for questioning. I wanted you to know that we're actively pursuing leads. The case hasn't gone cold. But it had. Grace could see it in Chen's eyes, hear it in the careful phrasing. 1 year out, with no physical evidence, no witnesses, no breaks. The case was ice cold. This trucker was probably nothing, just another dead end in an endless series of dead ends. After Chen left, Grace walked into the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water she didn't want. Through the window, she could see the backyard where Emma had learned to do cartwheels last summer, where Lily had planted a vegetable garden that had produced exactly 3 tomatoes. The grass needed mowing. The garden had gone to weeds. Everything was falling apart in slow motion. "Grace, we need to talk," David said from the doorway. She knew what was coming. She'd felt it building for months, the distance growing between them, the marriage crumbling under the weight of unprocessed grief. "I can't do this anymore," David continued, his voice hollow. "I can't live in this museum. I can't pretend they're coming back. I can't—" He broke off, covering his face with his hands. Grace watched him cry, feeling nothing. She'd cried so much in the first months that she'd exhausted her capacity for tears. Now she existed in a numb gray space where emotions were muted and distant, like watching life through frosted glass. "I'm not leaving the house," she said quietly. "I'm not packing up their rooms. I'm not moving on. I'm not asking you to move on. I'm asking you to survive. Grace, you barely eat. You don't sleep. You spend hours staring at their empty rooms. This isn't living. It's dying in slow motion." "Then I guess I'm dying." She said it without drama, simply stating a fact. David stared at her for a long moment, and she saw him make a decision. "I'm going to stay with my brother in Seattle for a while. I need some space to think." Okay. That's all you have to say?" Grace shrugged. "What do you want me to say? That I'll miss you? That I need you to stay?" "David, I don't feel anything anymore. I'm hollow. You should go if that's what you need." He left the next morning, a single suitcase in the trunk of his Honda. Grace watched from the window as he backed out of the driveway, not bothering to wave. The house seemed quieter without him, though he'd been a ghost in it for months anyway. March 1997. 3.5 years later, Grace had become an expert on missing children. Her home office, David's old study, which she'd converted after he moved out permanently, was covered in maps, newspaper clippings, printouts from early internet forums dedicated to missing persons cases. Red pushpins marked locations where girls matching Emma and Lily's descriptions had been spotted. Most were false alarms, wishful thinking projected onto random children at shopping malls and rest stops. She'd read everything: FBI case files, the ones Chen would share, academic papers on child abduction, memoirs by parents of missing children, true crime books about predators who operated in national parks. She knew statistics that haunted her dreams. Most abducted children who are murdered are killed within 3 hours of being taken. After 72 hours, the likelihood of recovery dropped precipitously. After a year, most law enforcement agencies considered such cases effectively closed, though they'd never say so publicly. Grace had also become intimately familiar with Redwood Crest National Forest. She visited every month without fail, sometimes staying for days, hiking trails, talking to rangers, showing photos to campers and asking if they'd seen anything unusual. She'd hiked every marked trail within 10 miles of Site 47, then ventured off trail, following deer paths and game trails into remote sections of wilderness. The rangers knew her by name now. Some were sympathetic, like Thomas Whitmore, who would share coffee with her and listen to her theories about the disappearance. Others were uncomfortable, averting their eyes when they saw her truck in the parking area, probably viewing her as a tragic figure who couldn't let go. But Grace had found things. Nothing conclusive, nothing that solved the mystery, but small pieces of evidence that the official search had missed. In 1995, she'd discovered a child's barrette caught in brush about half a mile west of Site 47. It wasn't Emma's or Lily's, Chen had confirmed that, but it proved that the search grid hadn't been as thorough as claimed. In 1996, she'd found a campsite that wasn't marked on any map, hidden in a hollow between 2 ridges, with evidence of semi-permanent occupation: a circle of stones for a fire pit, a makeshift shelter built from branches and a tarp, empty cans of beans and soup. The rangers had investigated the campsite and determined it was probably used by hunters during deer season. Nothing sinister. But Grace wasn't convinced. Someone had been living in those woods off the grid undetected. Who knew what else they might have done? Her obsession had cost her everything. David had divorced her in 1995, a quiet legal dissolution that she'd signed without reading the papers. Her teaching career had evaporated. She'd been on unpaid leave since the disappearance, and eventually the school district had simply stopped expecting her to return. Friends had drifted away, exhausted by her single-minded focus, unable to relate to her grief. Her parents-in-law had stopped calling after she'd screamed at David's mother for suggesting it was time to accept God's plan. Grace lived on David's alimony payments and what little remained of their savings. She'd sold the Portland house finally in 1996, not because she wanted to, but because she couldn't afford the mortgage anymore. She'd rented a small apartment in Eugene, 45 minutes from Redwood Crest, close enough to visit the forest every day if she wanted. The apartment was sparse, a mattress on the floor, a card table that served as desk and dining surface, cardboard boxes full of case files and maps. The only decoration was a bulletin board covered in photos of Emma and Lily, school pictures, vacation snapshots, candid moments captured on disposable cameras. Grace fell asleep each night looking at their faces, memorizing every detail as if repetition could somehow keep them alive. On March 15, 1997, Grace received a call from a woman who claimed to have seen Lily. The woman, her name was Sandra Reeves, she lived in Portland, had been visiting family in Medford and stopped at a gas station. While paying inside, she'd seen a teenage girl who looked exactly like the age-progressed photo of Lily that the FBI had released on the 3rd anniversary of the disappearance. She was with an older man, Sandra said, her voice breathless with certainty. 50s, maybe, with gray hair and a beard. He was holding her arm, not violently but firmly, like he was making sure she didn't wander off, and she looked scared. I could see it in her eyes. Grace was in her truck within minutes, driving south on I-5 with singular focus. Medford was 3 hours away. She'd be there by early afternoon. She'd find that gas station. She'd ask questions. She'd find her daughter. But of course it was nothing. The gas station clerk didn't remember any teenage girl matching Lily's description. Security cameras showed customers from that day, but none resembled Lily even remotely. Sandra Reeves, when pressed, admitted she'd only glimpsed the girl for a few seconds, that maybe she'd been mistaken, that she just wanted to help. Grace drove back to Eugene as darkness fell, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles ached. This was her life now, chasing shadows, grasping at possibilities that dissolved on closer inspection, riding waves of hope that crashed into walls of disappointment. September 2002, 9 years later, the 9th anniversary vigil at Redwood Crest was sparsely attended. A dozen people showed up, mostly die-hard volunteers from the original search, people who'd become invested in the case and couldn't quite let it go. Grace stood near the tree line at Site 47, holding a candle that guttered in the evening breeze, listening to a new ranger, Whitmore had retired 2 years ago, say words about remembrance and hope. Agent Chen was there too, though she'd been promoted and relocated to Seattle. She'd made a special trip down, which Grace appreciated even as she recognized it as probably a farewell gesture. After 9 years, even Chen had to acknowledge the reality. Emma and Lily were gone. Dead, almost certainly. Their bodies likely never to be found in the vast wilderness of Redwood Crest. But Grace couldn't accept that. To accept it would be to give up, and giving up would mean her daughters had died twice, once in whatever terrible moment had taken them from this world, and again in her own surrender to reality. After the vigil, Chen approached her. The agent had aged noticeably, streaks of gray in her hair, lines deepening around her eyes. This case had marked her too, Grace realized. Not as deeply as it had marked Grace herself, but enough to leave scars. "How are you holding up?" Chen asked. "I'm still looking," Grace said simply. "I know you are. Grace, I want you to know that I haven't forgotten Emma and Lily. I think about them often. I wish—" She paused, struggling with words. "I wish we'd found answers. It's not too late." Chen looked at her with something like pity, and Grace hated it. She didn't want pity. She wanted results. "I'm retiring next year," Chen said quietly. 25 years with the Bureau. I've worked hundreds of cases, and this is the one that haunts me, the one I couldn't solve. "Then help me solve it," Grace urged. "You have access to resources I don't. You can talk to people who won't give me the time of day. Help me find out what happened." Chen shook her head slowly. "Grace, I've done everything I can. We've exhausted every investigative avenue. That trucker, Kenneth Hartley, we questioned him extensively. He had an alibi for the weekend, it checked out. We've looked at every registered sex offender in Oregon and Northern California. We've chased hundreds of leads. There's nothing left to chase. Then I'll find something new. Or," Chen said gently, "you could try to rebuild your life. Emma and Lily wouldn't want you to sacrifice everything. Don't." Grace's voice was sharp. "Don't tell me what my daughters would want. You didn't know them." Chen nodded, accepting the rebuke. "You're right. I'm sorry." She reached into her bag and pulled out a business card. "This is my personal number, Seattle office. If you ever need anything, call me. Even after I retire. Please." Grace took the card, knowing she'd never use it. Chen was giving up just like everyone else. But Grace couldn't afford to give up. Her daughters were out there somewhere, in shallow graves, in the memories of a killer, in evidence that had been overlooked or misinterpreted. The truth existed, she just had to find it. September 18th, 2005. 12 years later. Grace woke before dawn on the anniversary, as she always did. Her apartment was dark and silent, just the hum of the refrigerator and distant traffic providing white noise. She was 49 years old now, her brown hair heavily streaked with gray, her face carved with lines that made her look a decade older. Her body ached constantly, knees worn from thousands of miles of hiking, back protesting from sleeping on cheap mattresses and countless nights in her truck. She dressed in layers, thermal underwear, jeans worn soft with age, a flannel shirt, a fleece jacket. Her hiking boots were on their third set of soles. She packed a small day pack, water, energy bars, a first aid kit, her camera, a handheld GPS unit she'd saved up to buy, and a printout of a topographical map marked with every location she'd searched over the past 12 years. The drive to Redwood Crest took 40 minutes in the pre-dawn darkness. Grace knew every curve of the road, every landmark. The park entrance was unstaffed at this hour, just a wooden sign and a self-pay station. She'd purchased an annual pass years ago. The rangers had eventually stopped charging her. She parked at the trailhead for Sentinel Grove, the hike they'd planned to take that day 12 years ago, the hike that had never happened. The sky was lightening now, stars fading as the sun prepared to breach the horizon. Grace shouldered her pack and started walking. She hiked for an hour before leaving the marked trail. This was her routine every anniversary. Start with the planned route, then deviate, exploring areas she hadn't covered in previous searches. The forest was vast, over 50,000 acres, but Grace had systematically worked through it grid by grid, year by year. Today she headed northwest from the trail, following a game path she'd noticed on her last visit. The path was barely visible, overgrown with ferns and blocked in places by fallen branches. Grace pushed through, her boots finding purchase on the needle-covered ground. The morning sun filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, illuminating dust motes and giving the forest an almost sacred quality. Birds called to each other. Varied thrushes, Steller's jays, the distant drumming of a woodpecker. In different circumstances, this would be beautiful. Grace had once loved hiking, loved the peace of wilderness. Now she saw only the thousands of places where something terrible could be hidden. She walked for another hour, pausing occasionally to check her GPS and mark her location on the map. The game path branched, and Grace chose the right fork seemingly at random. In truth, every choice she made in these woods was an act of desperate intuition, hoping that some maternal instinct would guide her to her daughters, as if they were still 9 and 12 and waiting to be found. The path descended into a shallow ravine, then climbed up the other side. At the top, Grace stopped to drink water and catch her breath. She was getting too old for this, her body protesting the rigors of off-trail hiking. But she couldn't stop. To stop would be to abandon Emma and Lily to whatever darkness had claimed them. That's when she noticed it. A structure partially hidden by undergrowth about 50 yards ahead. At first, Grace thought it was natural, a fallen tree creating a shelter, but as she approached she realized it was man-made, a hunter's blind, ancient and rusted, built from metal framework and camouflage netting that had rotted to tatters. Grace's heart began to pound. She'd found hunting blinds before. They dotted the forest, remnants of an earlier era when hunting regulations were laxer. But this one was different. It was positioned in a location with a sightline. She turned slowly, orienting herself, that looked directly toward where Site 47 would be. Maybe a quarter-mile away, maybe less. Her hands shaking, Grace approached the blind. The metal frame was orange with rust, the netting reduced to shreds. But the structure was intact, creating a small sheltered space about 6 feet square. Someone could sit here hidden and watch the campsite below. Grace circled the blind slowly, examining every detail. That's when she saw it. A piece of fabric caught on a branch at the entrance. Purple fabric, faded by years of sun and rain but still recognizable. Purple, like Emma's windbreaker. Grace's knees buckled. She sank to the ground, reaching out with trembling fingers to touch the fabric. It was synthetic, weathered but still intact. A piece about 3 inches square, torn from a larger garment. "Emma," Grace whispered. Oh God, Emma. She forced herself to breathe, to think rationally. This could be from anyone's jacket. Purple was a common color. But the location, the sight line to Site 47, the timing. Grace stood on shaking legs and entered the blind. The floor was dirt and rotted leaves, accumulated over years. But in one corner, beneath a layer of debris, she saw something else. A piece of plywood deliberately placed. She knelt and pulled it aside. Underneath was a small hollow, maybe a foot deep, dug into the earth. And in that hollow, perfectly preserved in the dry space beneath the plywood, was a child's canvas backpack. Yellow with a cartoon character Grace didn't recognize. Beside it, 2 thin bands of woven thread, friendship bracelets. One was purple and pink with silver beads. The other was blue and green. Grace had braided those bracelets herself 12 years ago, sitting at the kitchen table while the girls watched TV. She'd tied them onto their wrists the day before they left for Redwood Crest, Emma delighted with hers, Lily tolerating hers with teenage patience. With shaking hands, Grace reached deeper into the hollow. Her fingers touched something else. A stack of photographs. She pulled them out. Polaroids, about a dozen of them, the images faded but still visible. The first photo showed Site 47, taken from this exact position. She could see their orange tent, the picnic table, the Calder family's truck. The second showed Emma and Lily walking into the forest. The camera had caught them from behind, Emma's purple jacket visible, Lily's gray hoodie. The next photos were worse. Emma and Lily sitting in what looked like a basement, huddled together. Emma crying. Lily's face blank with shock, neither girl looking at the camera, as if they'd learned not to acknowledge whoever was photographing them. Grace made a sound, not quite a scream, more like a wounded animal's cry. She clutched the photos to her chest, her whole body shaking. Someone had watched her family. Someone had taken these photos. Someone had lured her daughters away and kept these trophies. And whoever it was, they had known about this hiding spot. They had returned here maybe many times to look at these souvenirs of what they'd done. Grace forced herself to look through the rest of the photos, cataloging every detail with the grim determination of someone who'd spent 12 years preparing for this moment. The basement had concrete walls, a small window near the ceiling. There was a mattress on the floor, a camping lantern. In one photo, a man's hand was visible at the edge of the frame, large, weathered, with dirt under the fingernails. The final photo was different. It showed only Emma's friendship bracelet, laid on what looked like soil or dirt. As if someone had removed it from her wrist and photographed it as a trophy, Grace carefully returned everything to the hollow, her mind racing. This was evidence. This was proof. She needed to preserve it, needed to contact authorities, needed to... Her phone had no signal this deep in the forest. Grace stood, her legs somehow supporting her despite feeling like water. She had to get back to her truck, had to call Chen, had to... She stopped. Someone had hidden these things here. Someone who might return. Someone who might still be coming to this spot, reliving whatever they'd done to Emma and Lily. Grace pulled out her camera and began photographing everything. The blind, the hollow, the backpack, the bracelets, each Polaroid. Her hands were steadier now, moving with purpose. Then she carefully replaced everything exactly as she'd found it, covering the hollow again with the plywood. She marked the location on her GPS, taking multiple readings to be certain. Then she retreated, moving carefully to avoid leaving obvious signs of disturbance. As Grace hiked back toward the marked trail, her mind was already planning. She would contact Chen. She would bring the police back here. They would set up surveillance, would watch this spot, and wait to see if anyone returned. After 12 years of searching, Grace Calder had finally found something real. Not answers yet, not closure, but evidence that her daughters had been taken by someone who had watched them, stalked them, and hidden proof of their crime in these woods. And somewhere in Oregon, that person was still alive, still walking free, still believing they'd gotten away with whatever they'd done to two little girls who'd only wanted to collect pine cones on a September morning. Grace emerged from the forest as the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees. Her face was wet with tears she didn't remember crying. But beneath the grief, beneath the horror of what she'd found, burned something she hadn't felt in years. Certainty. The truth was here, and she was going to uncover all of it, no matter how long it took or what it cost her. September 19th, 2005. The day after Grace sat across from Agent Chen in the FBI's Eugene Field office, the Polaroids spread across the table between them like toxic artifacts. Chen had driven down from Seattle within hours of Grace's call, her professional composure barely masking the shock in her eyes. "You didn't touch anything else?" Chen asked for the third time. "Just what I showed you in the photos. I put everything back exactly as I found it." Grace's voice was hoarse from crying, from explaining, from reliving the moment of discovery. Chen studied the Polaroids with latex-gloved hands, her expression growing darker with each image. "This changes everything. Grace, you found evidence of a staged abduction. Someone watched your family, planned this, executed it." She paused. "The question is who?" "Someone local," Grace said immediately. "Someone who knew that Blind existed, who could access the forest without raising suspicion. Maybe someone who..." She stopped, a terrible thought crystallizing. Chen looked up sharply. "What?" "The vigils," Grace whispered. "All those vigils over the years. The search parties. What if he was there? What if he watched us grieve, watched us search, knowing the whole time where they were?" Chen's jaw tightened. "We'll need to review every volunteer list, every person who participated in the searches. Cross-reference them with anyone who had access to that area." She reached for her phone. "I'm calling in a full forensic team. We process that site today before anyone has a chance to return and remove evidence." Within hours, Redwood Crest was swarming with FBI agents and forensic technicians. Grace led them to the hunter's blind, watching as they photographed, measured, and carefully excavated the hidden hollow. The backpack, bracelets, and Polaroids were sealed in evidence bags. A forensic team began processing the blind itself, searching for fingerprints, DNA, any trace that might identify who had created this hiding place. As the sun set, Agent Reeves, Chen's former partner, brought out of semi-retirement for this, approached Grace with a grim expression. "We found something else, buried about 3 feet from the blind. Grace, you should prepare yourself." They led her to a spot marked with evidence flags. In the fading light, Grace could see disturbed earth and something else, something small and white that made her stomach drop. "Bones?" Reeves said quietly. "Child-sized. We'll need forensic anthropology to confirm, but..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Grace's legs gave out. Chen caught her, easing her to the ground. We don't know yet, Chen said firmly. It could be. It's them, Grace interrupted. You know it's them. The forensic excavation continued through the night, portable lights turning the forest into a surreal stage. Grace refused to leave, sitting on a fallen log at the perimeter, wrapped in a blanket someone had provided. David arrived near midnight. Chen had called him. He looked older, grayer, haunted by ghosts he'd tried to escape. He sat beside Grace without speaking. After a long silence, he took her hand. She didn't pull away. You never stopped looking, he said finally. I couldn't. I know. I'm sorry I did. By dawn, the forensic team had carefully removed remains from 2 burial sites. Preliminary examination suggested 2 children, approximate ages matching Emma and Lily at the time of disappearance. Dental records would confirm identity within days, but Grace already knew. Her daughters had been here all along. Less than a quarter mile from where she'd spent 12 years searching, they had been buried in shallow graves near the blind of whoever had taken them. September 25th, 2005. The dental records confirmed what Grace already knew. The remains were Emma and Lily Calder. Cause of death couldn't be determined due to decomposition, but evidence suggested they'd died shortly after being taken, within the 3-hour window that statistics had always predicted. But the investigation was just beginning. Forensic analysis of the blind revealed fingerprints, dozens of them, remarkably preserved on the metal framework's protected surfaces. The FBI ran them through every database. They got a hit. Thomas Whitmore, the ranger who'd led the original search. The man who'd sat with Grace over coffee, listening to her theories, offering sympathy and support. The man who'd been at every vigil, every anniversary gathering, watching her grieve for daughters he'd hidden in his forest. Whitmore had retired 2 years ago, moved to a small property outside Eugene. When FBI agents arrived at his home with a warrant, they found a basement room that matched the Polaroids exactly. Concrete walls, small window, camping lantern still sitting in the corner. He'd kept them there for 3 days before killing them. 3 days while hundreds of people searched the forest above. 3 days while Grace and David had stood at press conferences, begging for their daughter's return, and then he'd buried them near his hunting blind and returned to help search for them, playing the concerned ranger, the helpful professional, the sympathetic friend. At his trial 6 months later, Whitmore showed no remorse. He'd planned it for weeks, he admitted. Watched the Calder family on previous camping trips, learned their patterns, waited for the perfect moment when the girls were alone and close enough to his position. He'd lured them with a story about an injured deer, led them to his truck hidden on a service road, taken them to his house. When he realized the search was too intensive that he might be caught, he'd killed them and buried them where he knew they'd never be found. Or so he thought. He'd kept the Polaroids and bracelets as trophies, visiting the blind occasionally to relive his crime. He'd never expected Grace Calder to keep searching for 12 years. Never expected her to venture off trail on the anniversary and find his hiding spot. She should have given up, Whitmore said during his testimony, his voice devoid of emotion. Everyone else did. June 2006. Grace stood in front of 2 headstones in Riverview Cemetery, flowers in her hands, purple irises for Emma, blue hydrangeas for Lily. The markers were simple, elegant, bearing their names, dates, and a shared inscription. Together always. David stood beside her, and for the first time in years, Grace didn't feel alone. They'd never remarry. Too much had been broken, but they'd found a way back to shared grief, to mutual remembrance. I'm sorry I gave up, David said quietly. You survived, Grace replied. That's not giving up. That's what you needed to do. She placed the flowers carefully at the base of each headstone, then stepped back. 12 years of searching had ended here, in this quiet cemetery, with answers that brought no comfort but at least provided truth. Whitmore would spend the rest of his life in prison. Emma and Lily were home, finally at rest. And Grace Calder could begin the impossible task of learning to live with what she'd found. As she walked away from the graves, Grace felt the weight of 12 years begin to lift, not disappearing, never that, but becoming bearable. She'd given her daughters the only thing she could: persistence, devotion, and finally justice. In the end, that would have to be enough.